Hello, everyone. How are you this morning? I hope everyone's doing well. And I'm Sonia Barboza, and I manage curation for the Harvard Dataverse Repository. And I provide a number of the trainings on curating data using the Dataverse software. You'll notice in the chat that there is an open notes document that you can use to take notes about this session and ask questions. And also note that the session is being recorded. I will leave time for questions and answers after the presentation. And please note that a number of things that I touch on today will be discussed further during the week, during the other sessions of the community meeting. So I do encourage you to register for the other sessions of the community meeting. If you haven't, registration actually closed on Friday, but I don't know how that's going to work if you try to register now. But a number of these topics will also be covered during that session. So we're going to get started. So this session is going to be on the Dataverse project for managing your research data. And I'm going to be talking about, as soon as I figure out my, my screen here, excuse me. Okay. So today's agenda is going to be a couple of slides on the Dataverse project, its purpose and how you can use it in a repository setting, how the Dataverse software supports research data sharing, Dataverse collections, data sets and files, and Dataverse and fair data principles. Now this session runs until 11:30, so I'm going to talk for about an hour, and then I'll leave about 30 minutes for questions. I might be done a little earlier than that, but we'll see. So what is the Dataverse project, right? It's an open source research data repository software. It establishes a research data management solution for your community, so that if your community in your country, in your organization, in your institution has a need to share data, this is a possible solution for your group. It's federated with a growing list of Dataverse repositories worldwide for increased discoverability of your community's data. An example of that, Harvard Dataverse harvests content from other Dataverse installations on the Harvard Dataverse Repository to increase discoverability and reuse. Researchers, journals, developers can all play a role in the Dataverse software in helping to develop features. Researchers can use it to gain full control over their data, receive web visibility, academic credit, and increase citation counts through our use of the Make Data Count feature and standard data citations that the tool provides. Journals manage the submissions review of their authors, and they link to publications of data associated with the published articles. And they also have the opportunity to include reproducibility verification workflows in their Dataverse spaces that they create with the software. Again, as mentioned, developers can contribute code, testing, documentation, and other standards. So if you are a developer and you're interested in helping the team, just reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you. So, with a repository, researchers and data users get access to data that they may have otherwise been unable to find, access, and reuse. So you don't just have an installation where your researchers, your community can share data, but researchers are going to come and access data. So it's not just for data sharing. Remember that you're sharing data for access. So think of a Dataverse installation as not only a data sharing tool, but a data reuse and data management tool. So IQSS leads the development team of the open source Dataverse project software. IQSS is here at Harvard University. The Open Data Assistance Program at Harvard, in collaboration with the Harvard Library, the Office for Scholarly Communication, IQSS, provides user support. So yes, if you have a Dataverse installation, you will need to have some services for your users so that they can contact you and ask questions, and you can provide training and workshops on how they can use your system, your repository. The Library Technology Services at Hewitt provides hosting and backup support of the Harvard Dataverse Repository, which is kind of another requirement that you should have when you have an installation of the software. So When we talk about the Dataverse project, we can't do so without including the community of coders, installations, and advisors that support the project. We also can't talk about it without mentioning the Global Dataverse Community Consortium, whose goal is to help organizations and institutions who would like an installation of the software to be able to have one with the full support of the Dataverse community. The vision of the Global Dataverse Community Consortium is to provide international organizations to existing community efforts, provide a collaborative venue for institutions to leverage economies of scale and support of Dataverse repositories around the world. There are currently 31 installations who are active members of the GDCC, and we have 67 installations of the Dataverse software worldwide. It's the intention that the consortium be community-driven, and ultimately the goals can be defined by the participants. So the GDCC believes that promoting open and inclusive practices that are formed in a transparent environment builds a strong partnership among our members, as well as with our external partner organizations. And they encourage membership from organizations both large and small from diverse communities around the globe. So some of the services of interest to members of the GDCC, which if you have an installation you can join, is there's a Dataverse repository installation and consulting service that you can contact Jonathan Crabtree at the Odom Institute for, that he leads. There's a GDCC GitHub repository, and there are benefits to data site membership when you are a member of GDCC in terms of cost as a Dataverse installation. So this is just a slide of the 69, I had said 67, 69 installations that exist around the world. And every time you have an installation of the software as a repository that is sharing data, because the Dataverse software code is open source, so people can use it for things other than sharing data, but we only put on the map those institutions that are using it for data sharing and are following standards for data sharing. So next, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the Harvard Dataverse Repository, because it's one of the repositories that's open to the worldwide research community for data sharing. So out of those 69 repositories that I showed you, most of them are serving just their community. There's a plan for an installation, for example, in Indonesia that will serve all of Indonesia, but it won't be servicing data from outside of Indonesia. And so I wanted to talk briefly about the Harvard Dataverse Repository because it's open to the worldwide research community. As long as you have research data to share, you can deposit your research data there. It's self-curated, which means you get to create an account and you get to deposit your content, okay? It's free up to 1 terabyte of research data. If you have more than that to deposit, you can contact us to discuss costs for supporting more than 1 terabyte of data. We have paid curation services that are available to assist groups and organizations that do not have sufficient staff to curate their data. You can also see that the UNC Dataverse and the Odom Institute Data Archive that are linked in here, and this presentation will be available on the community meeting website after this talk. But the UNC Dataverse and Odom Institute Data Archive provide a replication data services, and they also provide curation services if you're depositing data into their Dataverse. The Harvard Dataverse support page details how to get started with creating a space to share your research data on the Harvard Dataverse repository. So how the Dataverse software supports research data sharing. First, we have to talk about the FAIR principles and Dataverse. All repositories that are striving to share data are striving to share data to meet the FAIR principles. So what are FAIR principles? FAIR principles basically say that data need to be findable, they need to be accessible, they need to be interoperable, and they need to be reusable in order to be reused well and stored well and shared well. So Dataverse gives you the tools to move your data towards each principle. When I say it gives you the tools, that means that as users, you have to make use of the tools. It's there, and you just have to make use of it. So making data findable and discoverable with metadata, persistent identifiers that we provide, connections to searchable resources by using the links or standards for keywords, standards for topic classifications that we give you a space for. Accessibility is open and free for the software, but it allows authorization and authentication when needed. So the software allows you to do that you can put your data in and make it freely available and downloadable. But if data are restricted, for any reasons, we can allow authorization and authentication of users when it's needed. Data are interoperable for analysis on the Dataverse software with data analysis and visualization tools. And they're also there for storage and processing. And data are reusable because they are well described for use in multiple ways. That's how the Dataverse software helps you to meet FAIR principles. Okay, so you do your part by making use of all of the tools that we provide for you to use when you're talking about your data. Okay. Now, there are lots of features that we can talk about in terms of what the Dataverse software supports. Some of them that are just, it's useful for me to note here, and you can learn more about on the link that's provided at the bottom of this slide to the software features, are the data site, it's the data citation for data sets and files. So you get a data set level citation and you can get a file level citation with a DOI for the file that's different than the data set. That is something that you have to opt into providing if you have an installation. You have to support the DOIs. And again, with a GDCC membership, you get a discount on what you pay for supporting DOIs for your data sets. There is harvesting, OAI PMH harvesting, and there are numerous APIs for interoperability and custom integrations. Those are the things that people really want to know about most of the time. A number of the other things that you see here are things that are really required for you to have in order to support data well. So external tools for integrations, fixicity checks for files, publishing workflows, custom terms of use, so that an installation can allow its users to put in the necessary terms they need to share their data based on their data management plan, right? Hopefully your researchers at your organization are using data management plans to figure out how they're collecting their data and how they need to share their data, so that when it comes time to share their data, they know the proper license that they need to use to share their data. But Dataverse allows you the flexibility when using terms to share different types of data. There are faceted searches. There's Dataverse Collections, Dropbox integrations, backend storage on S3 or Swift. So there are a number of features that you can concentrate on. Again, there's a link to those features that you can go and explore on your own, and some of these will be talked about during the week. I know we're going to be talking about handling large files, large data during this week's session on remote storage and large data handling, and mapping of geospatial files. There's a geospatial session taking place as well this week. So this is a diagram of how an installation supports data sharing. An installation can support having both Dataverse collections, which are containers that a researcher can have to store all their data and all their collections of data and data sets. Or they can decide that all data sets must exist within a container. So they can have the Dataverse, they can have a Dataverse container, or they can have data sets, okay? Installations get to decide what they want to support. At one time, Harvard Dataverse allowed only the creation of Dataverse collections, and then your data sets needed to exist within those collections. Then we realized that some users didn't have a need for a Dataverse collection container. They had one journal article that they needed to share. The journal did not have a Dataverse collection space. So they just needed to come in and drop their data set into the main root of the Harvard repository, and that's it, get their citation. So now we support both. We support having a Dataverse collection, which is your container, and we support having a data set. Now, it's important to note that Dataverse collections containers, they actually hold the data sets, but the data sets are the ones that hold the files, the metadata, the terms, and the versions. Your Dataverse collections can hold sub-collections, and your sub-collections can hold more nested collections. So there's an ever-growing opportunity to nest and present your collection in a way that shows their relationships. And I'll show you some examples of those as we get through the talk. There are benefits to both, to an installation having both Dataverse collection containers and allowing this to deposit of data sets. But best practice is that if a researcher has multiple data sets, they should create a space they can customize their support to support their collection. A Dataverse collection container allows you to customize it with its own metadata, logos, links that supports the data well outside what the repository will allow. One of the things I'm going to talk about before I move on to talking about how we support data is the permissions and roles, because this is obviously a really important component of a Dataverse installation. So the Dataverse software allows permissions at every level. So the installation, the repository will have one set of controls, right? We have our team that manages and can see content that's in draft format, content that's published, and we can go in and make changes to data sets and data content as needed with the permission of the user. If you have an installation, you decide what roles your user will have in your installation. So can they deposit data sets and can they create Dataverse collections, or can they do both? As I mentioned earlier, the Harvard Dataverse allows both. You can create a Dataverse collection that you manage. So journals, organizations, institutions do this all the time. They create a Dataverse collection, they set up their metadata, and then they allow their authors to deposit content. We also allow authors to come in and just deposit a data set. But when they deposit a data set without a container, all they can do is use the metadata that we've set for the Harvard Dataverse, which is very limited for numerous reasons, being a self-curated repository. But the permissions allow you to decide what your users of your institutional repository can do. The Dataverse collections have permission settings at every level, and permissions are not inherited between collections. So journals, for example, can decide if their authors can deposit and publish a data set, or just deposit a data set and they have to submit it to the journal editor for review and publishing. That's the obvious workflow for a number of journals, a number of organizations, a number of institutions that use the Harvard Dataverse Repository for numerous reasons, because they want to control it. But just because you have permission to one Dataverse doesn't mean, to one Dataverse collection, doesn't mean you'll have permission to one of the nested collections. So that's how you can set it up, that some team members have the authority to, be curators and add data and publish content in one nested collection, but you have a whole different group that works on a second nested collection within that same container. So Dataverses are not, permissions are not inherited, and that's for obvious reasons as well, right? All data depositors should have an account that they create themselves. Just remember this, that if you have an installation, allow data depositors to have their own accounts. There's a lot of security reasons around that. We used to create accounts for Harvard Dataverse Repository users a long time ago. And it's one of the changes that I appreciate as a curator, is not having to create the accounts for them. And if a user is requesting restricted content from your repository, then they will also be required to have an account in order to access that data, okay? You will find permissions at your Dataverse, at your installation level, Dataverse collection level, data set level, and file level. And I'm going to show you what those permissions look like. Okay. So right now what you're looking for is, what you're looking at on the screen is actually the Dataverse level workflow. So it says who can add to this Dataverse, right? You can select any of them, that anyone adding to your installation or anyone adding to your Dataverse container within an installation needs to be given access. Anyone with a Dataverse account can add sub-Dataverses. Anyone with a Dataverse account can add data sets. So you give them one role about what they can do, but you're also giving them a second role at the bottom. These things work together. So when a user adds a new data set to this Dataverse, which role should automatically be assigned to them, right? So now we're looking at, will they be a contributor or will they be a curator? Journals tend to use contributors because contributors can't publish. So for journals, they want their authors to come in and put in their data sets, but they might have some reviews to do, and they may have some reproducibility verification to do. So the editors of the journal want to do that before the data are published. So the journal editors are responsible for reviewing and publishing the data set inside this Dataverse container. Curators are allowed to upload data, upload files, put in the entire data set, and they can publish as well. So for the Harvard Dataverse Repository, All of our users are allowed to come in and add a Dataverse or a data set, and they are curators because they get to publish their own content. This is the same workflow that anybody who owns a Dataverse container within your installation will also have to figure out for their personal container. Okay, so there's lots of flexibility there. Every time you go to a permissions page on the Dataverse network, you get roles. All the roles are listed here for you so that you can know what role a user should have, whether they're accessing data or whether they're creating content on your repository. And as a developer or manager of your own installation, you can add as many roles as you need with rules about how those roles work. In this case, the administrator has the most roles in a Dataverse repository or a Dataverse container, collections container, and the member has the least roles. So every time you hit a permissions page, whether it's in a Dataverse, a data set, or a file, you're going to see these options. So here are some, this is what a permission workflow looks like at the data set and file level. At the data set level, which is this top one here, I can give permission to a user, a team member, to curate a data set, to download all the files if they're a user. And the access level decreases from the top to the bottom. Again, admin to members. Admins have the most roles in terms of what they can do. That's at the data set level, okay? But if I have a data set that has restricted files, then if you look at the second image, at the file level, I have more control over who can access certain files. So I manage a repository called the Dataverse, the Murray Research Archive. And I have sensitive data that requires an application. And I have some data that have multiple waves, and some of those waves are restricted only to consortium members for that data set. So when somebody comes and requests access to those data sets for me, I can't give them access to every single file. What I do is I select the files that a non-consortium member can have access to, and I give them access to those files. And there are also some files within one data set that requires additional permissions from the contributors, and I don't give access to those files without those permissions. So I can skip over those files when I'm actually giving access to a user by using the file level permission settings instead of the data set level permission settings. At the data set level, if I give you permission to download something, you have the option to download everything in that data set going forward. Okay, Dataverse Collections, data sets, and files. So just going, I'm actually going to go back to this image right here real quick, just to give you another look at it, just to get familiar with this image. You have installations. Installations support Dataverse Collections, and they support data sets. Data sets belong in the Dataverse Collections. The data sets are the ones that hold the files, the metadata, the terms, and the versions. Your Dataverse Collection is what you customize with the metadata and the searchable facets that you want to support your data sets. And I needed to go back here because I'm going to start talking about each of these, the Dataverse Collection and the data sets as individual components here, okay? So the Dataverse installation, which we just talked about, it takes a bit of work to have a Dataverse installation, right? So you need a development team, you need a curation team, you need to have support for your users. Institutional organizational data repositories are what most people create when they install a Dataverse installation to support data. You need governance, preservation, stewardship, and funding. What data will you support? Are you going to support data just for your library, or are you going to do something that supports your entire, state or your entire country, right? How much data can you support? Because there are costs to removing large data, putting up large data, but really taking down large data every time it's downloaded. There are costs that you have to deal with, right? Including supporting the infrastructure, supporting staff to support all of the data. You should think about institutional collaborations, library, IT, sponsored research groups at your organizations or your institutions, right? Who will curate your content? Harvard Dataverse is self-curated. Will you have staff that curate your content? Will you have a mixed method? So even though Harvard Dataverse has a self-curated repository, we go in and review content that comes in every day, and we clean up the repository every week. So we are allowing you to put in content, but we also go in and make sure that it's actually data. And we allow you to make use of the features that we provide as you see fit, even though we do have best practices that we recommend. We do force some curation by having metadata that are required in the Harvard Dataverse, which you can do as well with the tool. Will you support integrated tools? For example, Data Explorer, which is the visualization and analysis tool that we provide at Harvard Dataverse, but there's also data tags that support sensitive data, and that's something that the Harvard Dataverse is moving forward with. But there's also another data exploration tool called Two Ravens. It's different. Maybe you, as having an installation, that's the tool that you choose to use to do data exploration and analysis on your installation. And there are a number of other integrated tools to help with reproducibility verification, geospatial data analysis that you want to consider. You have to have data management policies and best practices. And if you do decide to have an installation, you should really consider becoming a GDCC member for all of the reasons that I described earlier. Okay, so that's the Dataverse installation. Now, what did we talk about? We talked about Dataverse installations. One of the things that it supports are Dataverse Collections. Well, Dataverse Collections, when you create them in your installation, you set them up with metadata, searchable facets, and they are the ones that hold your data sets. The metadata and the searchable facets are there to support your data sets. And I think there are questions coming in. Please note that there's a document that we shared earlier that you can put your questions in, and I'll try to get to as many of these after the talk as possible. So your Dataverse collections are customizable containers to support your research projects, okay? The collections can hold nested collections that can be featured for easy discoverability, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. The important aspect of your Dataverse collections include the metadata choices to support your data and the searchable facets to support discoverability of your data sets within your collection. So keep thinking about FAIR as I'm talking about this when we talk about discoverability, findability. So findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. So the Dataverse collection does help to support the findability of your data by having a Dataverse container, a Dataverse collection. Right? Each nested collection can be customized with its own permissions, logo, URL, and I'm going to show you how it gives you the URL for your space that you can share to bring traffic to your page, metadata and facets, and so on. Once you create your Dataverse collection, you can begin to deposit your data sets using the metadata fields you selected when you created your Dataverse collection container. And if you find that you don't have the metadata that you need to support your data sets when you start actually adding your data sets to your container, you just go back and edit your Dataverse collection container with the proper metadata. It's an easy editing process for you to update your Dataverse collection container to support any kind of data that you have, okay? Depending on the size of your repository, you can allow your researchers to create their own collections like Harvard does. Or if you're a smaller organization, you can create department level collections that you can then add department heads to as managers of their own collections. So NTU out in Singapore does this. They create, they already have a shell that they've created for their university. For their institute. And so when a department head needs to add something and they go into that repository, they can already find the container there, the Dataverse collection space there for them to add content. So if you look at the screen, you'll see the first page where I'm naming my Dataverse. In this case, it's called the Sonia Barboza Dataverse. I'm going to put in an identifier. I'm going to select a category. Is it, am I a researcher? Is this space, am I a journal? Is this space supporting a research project? Is it supporting a teaching course? Those are categories that I can select from. But then the important step as well is the metadata field that you see on the right-hand side here, the metadata fields. What does my data contain? Does my data, citation metadata, by the way, is always required because that's going to help you get that standard citation where you have the author, and you have the title of the project. You get your DOI automatically by default. It's going to ask you to put in the description. It's going to ask you to put a contact in. That's required, and you can't change that setting. But I might have geospatial metadata that I want to add to my collection. I might have social science and humanities metadata. I might have life sciences metadata. And what's nice about the Dataverse tool is that if I'm missing a standard metadata block, or if I need additional metadata that's not in any standard, then I can create it. The administrators of that repository can create it to support the people that are depositing data into their installation. Browsable searchable facets are how you make your data discoverable in your Dataverse collection. Okay, so if I'm going to fill out keyword for a data set that I put into my Dataverse collection, then I want to make sure that the keyword term is selected as a searchable facet, so that when somebody comes to my Dataverse collection, they can find keywords and search by keywords if I have over 50 data sets and they want to narrow down their search. So I'm going to show you what that looks like in actual practice. Okay. So just to give you, before I show you the examples, a Dataverse collection, once you create one, these are the options that you have to edit it. You have the general information where you have the metadata, the facets, the descriptions that I just showed you on the previous page. And there we go. We have themes and widgets, and you can customize and add widgets to your Dataverse collection. Okay, and I'm going to show you what that looks like when it's all done. The permissions page I've gone over. Groups is another set of permissions. There are data set templates that will let you customize consistent data deposits and terms in your Dataverse collection. There's a guest book. So who's using your data and why? Well, there's a guest book that you can attach to your Dataverse container. Then there's also featured Dataverses, which let you highlight your nested Dataverse collections for discoverability. That's something that you can edit on and off, and you can display, 5 collections one week, 5 collections the next week. Okay, so what does this look like? All right, so I've pulled out, this is not actually what it looks like on your page. What I'm showing you on the right is a list of the searchable facets for the IFPRI organization that uses the Dataverse. It's one of my favorite use cases. It's housed at the Harvard Dataverse. They make great use of the customization tools provided by the software. They describe their collections well with links to the data management and open access policies, as well as those of their larger organizations, which is CGAIR, okay? They also link, as well as provide in their data search and their data set terms page, their terms of use licenses, and they clearly label their contact information for users in the description of their Dataverse container. So remember, this is a space that exists within the Harvard Dataverse Repository. You'll notice some of their nested collections are the ones that are featured, the ones that say Harvest Choice, ASTI, right? Those are their nested collections, okay? Each of these nested collections contain their own customization. As you can see, it's very different from the top level customization that you see. They have their own metadata, and they have their own searchable facet choices because they are supporting a different collection than the other one. So Harvest Choice is supporting a different collection than ASTI is. At the bottom of this, to the side of this slide, I've included, at the bottom of the slide, actually, I have included the personalized URL that's created with your Dataverse collection that can be used to share your Dataverse collection space. So as you can see at the bottom of the slide, this IFPRI is the identifier that they use for their container. This is their URL they get with the Dataverse software, and they can share that to bring traffic to their space. The URL is part of the customization process. What you see on the right-hand side when you get in a Dataverse repository is actually on the left, but I wanted to pull it out so you can see it well. Again, these are the searchable facets. So they have 602 data sets in here. They have 9 Dataverse collections. They have 11,000 files. Well, if I don't want to look at 11,000 files, I can go just into the Harvest Choice collection. That will narrow down my search to the 25 data sets that are in there. That's one way to start. I can also use the facets here, for example, under geographic coverage, country and nation, and I can search for just data that belong to Ghana or Malawi. I can also click on the file facets at the top. And with the files facet, when I expand that, I actually get to see file types, whether the files are restricted or open for access. And I can also see file tags to describe the files for me and tell me what kind of files they are. So I can narrow down my search by not just data sets, Dataverses, and files, but all these extra searchable facets that they put in here, okay? Another example is one that I pulled from UNC's Dataverse, and I've included part of the searchable facets content on the right, which displays the number of collections as 7, a total of 25 data sets within these 7 collections, and a total of 107 files within the data sets, right? But if I were to click just on the Western Carolina featured collection here, I would get whatever number of data sets were in there, whatever number of files. I wouldn't have to look at a total of 107 files or 25 data sets, okay? And I'll see only the searchable metadata that's related to the West Carolina University for the featured collection, okay? So those are your Dataverses. These are just examples of what Dataverses look like when you customize them and you're using the searchable facets and the metadata fields well, all right? There are some Dataverse collections that you'll click into and all they'll have are the default searchable facets that come with the repository setting. Okay, that's what you get if you just deposit a data set and you don't create a container and customize your container. So the next thing we want to talk about, so we've talked about installations, we've talked about Dataverse containers. Well, you know what those Dataverse containers hold outside of the settings for your metadata and searchable facets? Your metadata containers hold your data sets. All right, unless you're depositing a data set just into the root repository, your Dataverse containers are made to hold your data sets. But your data sets are the ones that hold the files, the metadata, the terms, and the versionings information, okay? Creating a data set to support your research project will depend on numerous factors, including making sure that you refer back to your data management plan, your DMP, if you completed one, to make sure your data are ready for sharing and it's being shared ethically and correctly. A number of funding agencies are going to give you instructions on how to share your data. Some of them are requiring that you put it into a repository, or you're putting it into a repository that supports your discipline. So make sure you're following what your funding agency requires. Not all installations will support the sharing of sensitive data content, which means you have to de-identify your data before it's shared. Harvard Dataverse is one of those that does not support sensitive data yet, but we have a tool that we're integrating, and when that integration is complete, we will be supporting sensitive data. Keep in mind that sharing a de-identified version of your data is still data sharing. You have to consider whether or not the data will be completely open for access, or if you have files that require more user vetting before they're made available. Because remember, even when you de-identify a data set, if you had to de-identify it, it's probably a good idea that you restrict those files with some terms to know who's accessing your file, just to be sure, okay? Also figure out who needs to receive credit for your work. So we provide a space for you to give credit to your co-authors, to your grant agencies, to your producers. They all have a space to receive credit with the metadata fields made available to you when you're creating a data set in the Dataverse repository. You can choose which files, when you're adding files, need restricting and which can remain open for access. For example, documentation files are usually left open for access so users can determine if the data set contains the information they need for their project, right? If they can't see your files because everything is restricted, and you haven't provided enough metadata, they might not be able to tell if your project is going to suit their needs, okay? If your data set is to be considered for reproducibility verification, you need to make sure to include the code, the README file, and data needed for that purpose. It's also a good idea for you to verify your reproducibility using your own instructions before uploading your content. So whatever instructions you're giving to users, you make sure those instructions work by doing it yourself, okay? Now, a few of our journal depositors, our journal Dataverses in the Harvard Dataverse Repository, they use ODM's reproducibility verification services, and at least one of our journals, Political Analysis, is using CodeOcean, working in collaboration with CodeOcean, which does reproducibility verification before the content is published on their Dataverse space in the Harvard repository. So when you're creating a data set, you want to include as much metadata as needed to make sure your users aren't left with too many questions about your data set. One of the things that we know determines how data are used, how often data are used, is data that are curated well with good metadata, good descriptions, files are described well, the features are used. They get more use than a data set that somebody has to try to understand on their own because sufficient information wasn't included when it was deposited. Okay. So now we're going to talk about files, metadata, terms, and versions as we go through this, okay? So now for the data set, to continue with the data set. When you create a data set, you get options to edit that data set as you work towards publishing, right? When you first create a data set, they're created in draft format and published when they are ready to be shared. Meaning you have added all the necessary files that you want to share in this version, right? Not everything has to be shared right away. You determine what you can share first, and then you can edit the data set and add more files later. So you've added enough metadata or files, metadata, and you've added your terms, and it's ready to share. To share your data set while it's in draft format, example for review, if you need somebody to review it, there's a private URL feature that will create a temporary URL that authors can enable and disable for sharing. So if I need to share my data set with Danny and my team before I publish it, even though he has access to the Dataverse, I can send him a private URL of my draft data set and say, take a look at this and tell me what you think. Does it look okay? Did I put enough information? Once they give me a go ahead, I can go ahead and publish it, right? You can also use this for peer review, right? Because the person doesn't have to log in to see the draft data set. So if you need to do some kind of peer review, the private URL is great. Once a data set is published, the options are available to upload more files, add more metadata, edit your terms, your permissions, use thumbnails and widgets. So this is what we call versioning. After you've published a data set and you need to make changes, we call this versioning. You don't delete your data set when you need to make a change and start over. You're going to lose your DOI if you do that, first of all. When you have a published data set, what you do is you edit it to go forward to show the history of the data set, and that's called versioning of the changes. A data set in file format will reserve, a data set in draft format will reserve your DOI. So the DOI that you see in draft format is the DOI that you're going to get when you publish it. But that DOI is not registered until you publish your data set. Okay? And before I get to the files and metadata details, one of the things that you see in this list of edit options is called deaccession a data set. That's what I'm going to talk about now. Once you publish a data set, the only option to remove that data set is to deaccession it. You cannot delete it, because if somebody has accessed your data set, they're going to need to see that citation, whether or not you keep that data set. They need to have that citation available to them. This is following FAIR principles. And so this tombstone page is what we call it, is what deaccessioning does. And it leaves the citation as required by FAIR principles to show that this data set did exist in this repository. Where is it now? And as you can see, this person has a note saying this data set has been transferred to another repository. I actually don't think that's what this person did with this one right here. I think they recreated it and they used that note, because when you transfer a data set and you do deaccessioning, if you transfer it to another repository, what should you have here? You actually should have a link to the DOI to the other repository to show the person where the data set now exists, because this person has left a dead end. It doesn't tell me where that other repository is. So we're working on educating users on how to do deaccessioning well and how to do it properly. But that's, so, when we talk about the options, that's what you have for a data set. So we talked about what data sets give you, right? So let's start at the top. The whole point of data sharing is really about that data set, which is made up of files, the metadata, the terms of access, and the citation and features that make a data set findable and reusable. The container is an added feature that allows you to neatly organize your content and carefully select the metadata you need to support your data set, right? So we've talked about the Dataverse collection and now this data set. The Dataverse software provides standard citation for all data sets. You get author, year, data set title, the DOI that we provide. You have to put in the author information and you have to put in the data set title, just so you know. Repository name is provided and versioning is done by default. If you look to the right of the page, Make Data Count is a project to collect and standardize metrics on data use, especially views, downloads, and citations. The Dataverse software can integrate Make Data Count to collect and display usage metrics, including counts of data set views, file downloads, and data citations. And you will see that as you go through a Dataverse installation, a repository. You will see some of this in the Files tab of the dataset page. You'll see a download for each file as the files are listed. But the citation is what you're looking for, right? Everybody wants their citation. They want to get credit. The Dataverse tool software standardized dataset citations, and this is what all of the dataset citations look like in a Dataverse repository. And of course, it gives you the ability to cite your dataset in a number of ways and learn about dataset citation, citation standards with the links that we provide. So every data set along with that citation that you saw at the top includes metadata, a required subject field, as well as you can see at the bottom here, there are files, metadata, terms, and versioning. In this case, you can see a red lock next to the file name, which indicates this file is restricted for access and thus to meet FAIR guidelines on reusability. The terms page of this data set must have information on how this data set can be accessed by users, especially if they're not using the feature that we provide called request access. It's a feature that would show up here to any user if you could just email the author and request access to the file. If you don't see that next to a file with a red lock, that means their terms page should be filled out with information on how to access this restricted file. Okay, sometimes it's simply contacting the author under the terms, or sometimes they have a whole application that you have to fill out, a data use agreement, before you can access restricted content. But what I wanted you to notice about this page was that when you have a data set, the citation is literally at the top, and then you get the description, you get some metadata, but you also have a metadata tab that will expand and provide more information, but you get a file page, metadata, terms, and versions. Every data set has that information. Okay. So right here, I'm looking at the files page. So I've tabbed down to the files page, 2 restricted files that show up here. All file types are supported by the software, but we encourage the use of open and interoperable file types as often as possible. And I'll have some information on that coming up in the next slides. We have a number of integrated tools available to the community, and I've put a link in my notes to that deal with files. And so I wanted to include that here. And because Harvard Dataverse integrates some of these tools, and I'm going to show them to you in my examples, but not all repositories are integrating tools. So you're going to get a different experience depending on the type of tools that you integrate into your repository. So in this case, I'm only showing you 2 files. One is Adobe PDF file. The other one is a tabular file, which I'm going to talk about because tabular files are handled in a special way in the Dataverse tool for interoperability and data exploration and visualization. So we're going to talk about that. So the tabular files that I mentioned to you, file handling in the Dataverse software offers the additional archival preservation features for certain files and their metadata. Okay, these are the tabular files. The goal of our ingest process is to extract the data content from the user's file and archive it in an application neutral, easy readable format. So the structure of the metadata defining tabular data variables used in the Dataverse software was originally based on the DDI codebook format, and you can see an example of the DDI output in the links that are going to be included in the notes section of this slide when it's put up. Okay. Tabular data files extract the number of variables and observations of a file. So if you're looking at the file that I have up here now, you'll be able to see that there are variables and observations for these tabular files. Okay, and you also note that they have nice tags to tell me their data and their survey. I'm not sure what Bauchi means here, but it means something to this data. And the tabular files, if you look at the arrows that I'm pointing to, these files can be downloaded in their original format. And in this case, it tells you that this original format was a state of 14 file. But I can also download it as a tab delimited file, as an R data file. I can get variable metadata, data file citation. And I can also use view data and data explorer. All right. And these are integrated tools that I can use to visualize the data for a tabular data set. All right. And so Data Explorer is created by Scholars Portal. The file previews was initially created by QDR, and I know there are some other groups supporting them right now, and I have a link that I provide for that feature that talks a little bit more about it. So these are tabular files that I'm showing you, and we're going to talk a little more about what formats are supported for tabular files. These are the formats that if you upload your data in these formats, they will be converted most likely to tabular format. Some of them fail. It doesn't mean anything. If they fail to ingest for tabular support, they can still be downloaded in the original format. Some of the files that we have to work with, SPSS makes it a little harder to convert files into these tabular formats because their software is just not open that way. But Stata is, right? Stata software is open and it's easier for us to manipulate and get the tabular ingest to work. So it supports SPSS, Stata, R, Excel, CSV, okay, for now. And we try to support every version of these file formats as they come up. So here's an example of one of those tabular data files to show the Data Explorer tool that's created by Scholars Portal and integrated into the Harvard Dataverse. It provides analysis and visualization of the tabular data file. And there's a link at the bottom of the slide to the Data Explorer version 2 that is being used. So I get the file name right here. This is the data set. This is the file right underneath it. It tells me which study it's coming from with the DOI. But I want you to note that there's a chart view, there's a table view, and I can select, if I know how to work with this data, I can select variables and I can do some visualization and analysis on here and graphs and charts. If this data were restricted for access and you were not logged in, you would not be able to use this tool. The Data Explorer cannot be used on tools that are restricted for access, and neither, and you also can't use the data previewer on files that are restricted for access. This is the data previewer. Okay, and these are a set of tools that display the contents of files. We have it for audio, images, PDFs, video, tabular data, spreadsheets, and you can view them without downloading them. The previewer can be run directly from GitHub IO, so the only requirement step is using the Dataverse API to register the tool that you want to use, the previewer. And note that the Data Explorer and the file previewer tools will not work on files that are restricted for access, as I mentioned earlier. But this is also a file. This happens to be a tabular data file that I'm previewing. Okay. So now we can move on to metadata. We've talked about data sets and files. And now we're going to talk about data sets and metadata, because that's what the data sets hold. They hold the metadata as well. So the Dataverse project is committed to using standard compliant metadata to ensure that a Dataverse installation's metadata can be mapped easily to standard metadata schemes and be exported into JSON formats, XML for tabular file metadata for preservation and interoperability. And this gives you the information on the specific metadata that's supported in the Dataverse project. Okay. We've talked about custom metadata blocks can also be created. So remember when you create your Dataverse container that you saw this metadata field? Well, you're selecting metadata here that's going to determine what you can put in when you put in a data set. So when you create your container, you select the appropriate metadata that you know is going to be in your data set, And that's how you get to support all the metadata that you see here. This is an IFPRI data set. They do a great job with their keywords, topic classifications. They link it to standards and agriculture. Their descriptions are nice and long and detailed. They have a templated title that they use in their data sets, so that all of their data sets have a certain way of putting in the title. They use notes, they use producers, they use language fields, so they give us a lot of information about their data. Also note that on the right-hand side that the metadata can be exported in several formats: Dublin Core, DDI, OAI, or OpenAir, schema.org, JSON, okay, in terms of support for metadata. So terms, all right, you created a data set, you put in files, you put in metadata, but if some of the files are restricted, I need to know how to access it. And we've talked about terms, right? If you restrict your files, in order to meet FAIR standards, you have to have information on how I can access the data set. It's made to support, so Dataverse is made to support any license needed for data sharing. For example, Harvard Dataverse by default supports CC0, but users can opt out of this license and they can select any license they need to meet data sharing requirements for their data, or they can just put in any of their terms of use. So there's terms of use licensing and installation policy breakout sessions taking place this week on Wednesday that will highlight additional work and discussions around licensing and the software. But I just wanted to show you an example of IFPRI's terms for their data set. So this is one example of, you know, their files were here, their metadata here, then the terms tab tells me how to access that file. So if I click on their file and actually try to access a file, these terms are going to pop up for me to accept on a Dataverse repository. They'll pop up when I click on a file and they'll say, you need to accept these terms in order to continue working. So this is not a restricted file, but these are their terms of use for me to use that file. And versioning is the last thing that you get with a data set. So we had files, metadata, terms, and versions. So versioning of a data set and files are provided by the software by default. Users should learn when to replace content and when content may need to be deleted when you're doing versioning. Replacing and editing existing content is always best practice because it leaves a record of what was there before. But there may be some cases that require that data be deleted, right? Did you really put up really extremely sensitive content that you just shouldn't have put up at all? Versioning options are flexible and can be controlled by the user except when replacing files. When you replace the file, the system will actually push your existing published content to a major version 2. So you'll go from like version 1 to version 2 instead of version 1 to version 1.1. If I make brief metadata changes or I'm editing some spelling mistake, I can take my data from version 1 to version 1.1. That version 1.1 will show up in the background under the versions tab, but the version of my citation will remain as version 1. Whereas if I change a file, the version in my actual citation will go to version 2. And I've included a link to a publication on versioning metadata and provenance by Mercedes Crosas as a link on this slide for further reading and further information. So we are at Dataverse and FAIR, which I've talked extensively about. I just want to introduce the FAIR concepts here. We've covered numerous ways the software supports FAIR principles, and the rest of the conference talks will cover the tools, features, and technical aspects of the software that led to FAIR. So, and I've also, linked to the FAIR principles if that's something that you are unfamiliar with, so that you can get familiar with it, right? And I've included the roadmap or the high-level roadmap for the Dataverse project. There are links to the roadmaps and the features that are being developed. But as you can see, we have some high-level strategic goals that our development team works on. The handling of sensitive large data and streaming data have been on our timeline for a while now and is constantly being discussed by our community. Expanding data and metadata features for other disciplines, expanding archival and preservation features, interoperability, increasing the contributions from the open source development community helps us to move these features along, improving the design of the UX and the UI, and of course, continuing to increase the quality of the software. But if you go to dataverse.org, there are additional features that are being worked on with every release. So that's a good place to start. I do have a couple of pages to share for you really quickly, and then we can get to questions. So thank you very much. And I just wanted to show you just another collection. This is a collection that I manage with it is sensitive data, but the data have been de-identified, and all of the data files in here are restricted for access. This is the Henry Murray Research Archive. We have an application form for every single data set in here. Outside of a few that are just in here because they like our terms of use, but they're not an actual part of our original collection. And so, as you can see, we have these collections. I have 8 Dataverse sub-collections in here, or collections of data by Library of Congress terms or collections. I have 441 data sets in here and 7,940 files. If I just click on the Dataverse facets, I want to show you that all you're going to see are the 8, and my system has been slow for a few days now. I didn't want to restart because I had everything up and ready to go. So you'll have to excuse all the tabs that I've had open. But these are my 8 Dataverse collections for the Murray Research Archive. These are the 386 data sets that are available for you right now, and I'm not logged in, so you're only seeing published content. So I will show you the 386 data sets once they load. So these are all data sets. Okay, and as you can see, I have a lot of searchable facets, so I can narrow my search down to a kind of study, to survey, field studies, or academic achievement, or abortion, or college students. And then the file facets, I wanted to show you the file facets because I wanted to give you a view of what it looks like to be able to search by the different aspects related to files in here. And so when I'm searching by the files facet that I clicked on, I get the publication year. These are showing me that these files are restricted. These files are open, right? They're PDFs, inventories, and things that users might need to access to make to determine if they want to use my data. There's document files, tabular files, data. There's some unknown files in here because the system is constantly working to identify new files that it was not built to identify to begin with. I have file tags that tell me if I have data, documentation, supplementary documentation, and it can also tell me what's restricted and what's public. So if I click on the restricted here, I'm only going to get restricted files. And then if I click on public, I get public content. This is the IFPRI Dataverse that I showed you earlier, and I wanted to show you the rest of their page. As you can see, they have a lot of useful search facets. And if I click on the ASTI collection in here, I no longer have 788 data sets when I'm in the ASTI collection. When I'm in the ASTI collection, I'm only going to get what's available for the ASTI collection, which helps me to narrow my search down to, well, in this case, they have 602 data sets, which is one of their bigger collections. I can go back and I can get a smaller collection in here. But the NC docs, this Dataverse right here is at ODM. And if I click on the one of their sub collections, I get 2 data sets, the Appalachian State University Dataverse, then I get 2 data sets with 10 files. I also have opened the feature page. And, if you want to talk about APIs, there's Search API, Data Deposit API, Data Access API, Metrics API. There's more information on this features page about all the APIs that we have available to you. Native APIs that, you can delete role assignments, you can list versions of a data set, you can assign a new role on a data set. So the APIs are pretty extensive for batch work, scripting. And there is one last thing, and then we can take questions. So when you have a Dataverse collection in the Harvard Dataverse or any Dataverse, there's a feature called a widget. And the widget allows you to take your Dataverse collection and put it on your personal website. So Gary King uses the Scholar site. The Scholars, goodness gracious, I forget now, Open Scholar, that builds the faculty pages and websites that we use at Harvard. And his Dataverse widget is in his faculty page. And what it does is it displays his Dataverse directly on his Scholar site. So he's not in the Dataverse, in the Harvard Dataverse right now. I'm on his website. And if I click on the data set, I get to view and use his data set right here. But if I click on the DOI, it's going to take me back to the Harvard Dataverse Repository, because that's what DOIs do. That's the purpose of the DOI, is to make sure that you can get to the repository that you have. Okay, so I'm going to be happy to take some questions if they haven't already been answered, because I think Danny's been working on the background to answer questions.
Danny has been doing very little. It's been the other attendees that have been answering
wonderful.
questions.
Even
so
better.
That's great. Yeah.
Is even better. So any questions that I haven't answered? Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to start at the bottom because it's easier. Jose Carvalho asked, is it possible to verify if the data provided by the person requiring access to a certain content is valid, if the email exists or if the person requesting access is in fact who it states? So remember, the guest book can be used in a couple of ways. You can have restricted files and use the guest book. You can have open files and use the guest book. So your guest book, when you create it, and I'm just going to show you. Thank you, Deirdre. I appreciate you. I'm going to show you a guest book preview. I'm going to show you a guest book preview. Let's see. I guess I should do it in my own Dataverse. So guest books.
So just really quick, Sonia, you're not sharing your screen anymore.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for
no
reminding me. I start talking and I forget. All right, I'm going to share. This is the one I want to share. I'm just going to log in. I don't have a guest book set up here. I might actually have a couple because I have an application form. I don't use the guest book for my Murray archive Dataverse, but I have a couple here. So I have one study, the block and block longitudinal data set, that I have a guest book attached to because it came under a different data use agreement. So they don't use the application form, but I need to know who's using it. And what I have required is the name, email, institution, and position, and what they're going to be using this data for. And the data might or might not be actually restricted. I have to check. But when I have if it's restricted, they can't get access to the data. But after I give them access to it, they will be prompted to fill out this guest book anyway. The guest book, the way it works is that if you have open data, a user is going to click on your file, the guest book is going to pop up, they're going to fill it out. And once they submit that guest book, they get to download the data. So you don't have time beforehand to verify their email. You're welcome to email them afterwards if you've collected that information and verify who they are. So you make choices about your data. If you need to validate who's using your content, then you might not want to have open data. You might want to restrict your data and use another form to communicate with potential users. Guest books are made to be used for data that are open, and you want to collect information on them. IFPRI uses a guest book for a lot of their data, and they download that content quite often. And they create these reports after they de-identify their guest book. They create these reports for their funding agencies on how the data are being used, which files are being used, because it gives you information on the file, whether it was downloaded, whether it was explored directly on the Dataverse repository. So they use that information to communicate with their funding agencies and their researchers on how the data are being used. So the other person asked, in the Gary King, it was a direct message to me, but I'll read it. In the Gary King Open Scholar page example, if the user clicks on the data set, there will be counted. Yes, if they download the data file, it will be counted. I think that's what you're asking. The data set is not what you don't, you download files from a data set. So they're going to be counted if you download it from their page. I'm trying to go back and see if there are any questions that I missed.
Hi, Sonia, a question from my side.
Hi.
So yeah, it was very informative session. Thank you for the presentation. So my question is related to the Dataverse upgrade. So our Dataverse is currently running on a physical server, which is running on CentOS 6.5. So we are trying to upgrade it, but we are facing many challenges. So the second thing we are planning is to migrate the Dataverse to another physical machine. Do we have any script or any documentation provided by the team?
Danny, you can take that?
Sure, I'll try. Yes, so if it's part of the normal upgrade process, we do try to highlight any necessary changes in the release notes. If it's migrating from one system to the other, there are tools in the community to enable that. I know Stefan in the last presentation talked about that. I think probably the best option would be to ask that question in the Dataverse community group, and I'll add a link in the chat, because there's probably a system administrator out there who's gone through the exact same thing and may have a solution to share. So I'll go ahead and include the link there, and I definitely suggest that you ask the question in the Google group.
Sure, Dan. I've already dropped an email to the team. I'm waiting for the response. So yeah, I'll try to communicate through the community.
Yes, and I think the delay is my fault. We've been busy preparing for the meeting, so I don't think I've responded to that ticket. So no I do apologize.
And no worries, Dan. Yeah, no worries. That's fine. And another question: do we have any restrictions that Dataverse will be running on particular OS, and it is like not supporting a different OS? Like currently, it is running on CentOS, and we are planning to migrate to Ubuntu. So do you have any such restrictions?
So I wouldn't say there are restrictions. There's things that are used by the community. Ubuntu should be fine, but there are definitely some things used more than others. So that might be another good question for the Google group. And we're seeing some responses in the chat that there are people that are running Dataverse on Ubuntu. So that's great.
Okay. So there was a question about, Manuela asked about adding field, because we talked about being able to customize a metadata block. That's, if you don't have enough metadata to support your data set, we can add, create a metadata block to support additional fields. And she asked if we can add fields to describe dataverses. So it would be good to have an example of what you want to add. What is it that you're thinking about? And then that becomes a community discussion. So remember, the community is a big thing when it comes to Dataverse. We don't make decisions on our own. We make decisions that are community-based and community-supported. So Manuela, if you have an example of something you want to add to describe a Dataverse. The Dataverse that for example, that I showed you, and I'm going to show you this one. There's a description field that allows me to put in quite a bit of information to talk about my Dataverse. I can put links in here, like IFPRI had, extensive links on their Dataverse to give you information about their policies, their data management. And the only other thing that you were going to do was select your metadata in your facets. So if you have an idea of what it is that you actually want to add here to describe your metadata, to describe your Dataverse, what would that be? And you're welcome to think about that. You're welcome to drop your suggestion in the chat. I was just needing a more concrete idea of what you wanted to add here, but it's not, that again, that would be changing the whole this design. So it's not like it's not the same thing as the metadata block for the data set. It's a different design change to this page. So I'm trying to get to scroll up to the rest of the questions. How we add DO, oh, sorry, Philip, I might add how we add DOI at collection level. Philip, so the DOIs are added to the data sets. I know there's been discussion about having Dataverse level DOI. Yeah, collection versioning DOIs. That's a discussion that they're having. So that's not possible now. Right now, DOIs are possible for your data sets. Oh, well, Philip's doing, okay, you can talk, Philip, you're welcome to jump in and talk about that. That's not something that we're doing. And I don't know how that's being right now, what that conversation is in the community about accepting that as, you know, a standard. So do you want to talk about that a little bit, Philip?
Yeah, I can just add. So we have a few sub collections, and they wanted to have a DOI for their sub collection. So we just minted this DOI in through a DataSite. So this is a manual process. So you just fill out the DataSite metadata schema for collections, and then you create the DOI, and then we add the DOI to in this description field that you just showed. So it's a manual process right now.
Okay, yeah, because that's not something we've done, and as far as I know, with my team, there's been discussions about it because people do want DOIs for their Dataverse collections. Their Dataverse collections are holding quite a bit of their content, and so this is why I actually stress people creating a Dataverse container, a Dataverse collection to put their content in instead of just dropping a DOI, instead of just dropping in a data set, because when you have a Dataverse container, then there are these discussions about having that Dataverse level DOI. Then you get a data set level DOI and you have a file level DOI. So it's good to know about your use case, Philip, because we haven't done anything like that yet. So if people want to join those conversations, is there a discussion on the Google Dataverse group about that you're leading or anything, Philip?
No, not that I'm aware of. I can link a DOI to one of the collections.
Yeah, you should, just so that people who are interested in it can see what it actually looks like and how you guys are doing it for now. So I am trying to see if there's.
And so
somebody, oh, sorry, Danny, you want to talk about the Dataverse in Space 7?
Sure, I'm typing a response.
Okay.
But just really quickly on the manually minting DOIs for Dataverse collections, I did add a link to the Google group discussion that was where the process was discussed. And then regarding integration with DSpace 7, so we are having discussions with the team here at Harvard Library to better integrate the two systems using linked data notifications. I'm using the notify standard. And so, you know, the goal is that when a publication gets deposited into the DSpace instance at Harvard, that the data can have a related publication set up to that to that article automatically. So with APIs from both platforms, more integration is certainly possible, but we also do have some specific stuff that we're working on.
Mm-hmm. And we are just going back to the guest book really quickly. Lily Falk, you had a question about the guest book. The guest book is only available to the administrator of that Dataverse container. Guest book information is not shared with users and guests. Okay, so it's collected in the back end for the administrator and the curator of that Dataverse container.
So can the administrator and curator then see specifically which users have downloaded which data sets?
Yes, you'll
get they download.
You get the information that they put in. The information that you request is what you're going to get in. Is what you're going to get. So when you create a guest book, you want to make sure you're asking for the right information. Do you want just their email, or do you want their name, email affiliation? Do you not want email? Some people just collect a name, no email. So as long as you set up your guest book to collect certain information, that information is going to be required to be filled out. And it's going to be available to you absolutely on the back end. Every time they come back in and do something, they're going to have to agree and do the fill out the guest book. So it'll show you how many times they've downloaded something. It'll list their name several times.
And so in that case, if users are required on our Dataverse to fill out the guest book, does that mean that every user, in order to download data from our Dataverse, needs to have an account with the Harvard Dataverse?
No, there's no guest book. There's no account. There's no account associated with open data.
Okay.
You're asking them to fill in information. You're not asking them to create an account.
So if they leave and come back, will the browser just remember that they filled out the guest book?
No, they'll fill it out again, depending on what
Okay.
they're accessing.
Okay.
Yeah, it tells you how. So when you look at a guest book, if I've downloaded your, one file 50 times, you're going to see me there. And that's why the guest book, you download it and you clean it up.
Okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm trying to go up the list and see if I missed anything, but if you have any questions, it's possibly if I've missed it, it's better that you just chime in and ask. But I think everybody else did a great job of answering questions, which is appreciated. So these slides will be available for you, but if things change, features change, designs change really quickly on Dataverse. So we'll have to do a new one next year, a new workshop, a new intro to introduce new features and new designs. So, but take it for what it is, because most of the standards are going to remain the same. The only thing we'll be adding are any improvements to the tool. But I do hope that this was helpful, and I hope to see you guys in the rest of the sessions during the week. And you can reach out to us at support@dataverse.harvard.edu with any questions that you have about the software or about curating data using the software. Thank you for coming. But I see more messages. What did I miss? Oh, somebody asked about handles and changing back to data site DOIs, but the Dataverse software supports both. So it's really, I think, what's cheaper for you to support.
Yeah, and just to expand on the handles answer, in the Harvard Dataverse Repository, we used to use handles, and now we use DOIs, and so we were able to set up alternative identifiers, and the handles still resolve, and then the DOIs also exist for the data sets. And then I also saw another question about an inventory of existing external tools. So I'll go ahead and add.
Oh, you got it. I was going to put that in the chat.
Yeah, no.
I'll put it in there. Here,
No worries. Thank you.
I think that's the right link. It's a little weird. The link looks a little weird. It's probably just me. External tools. Yeah, my link looks so weird. But I think that link will work. Great, wonderful. Okay.
And yes, we will be making the recording available.
Okay. And you are very welcome. I'm glad to see that so many people were interested in this talk. So see you guys at the rest of the community meeting.
Yep, and I'll be sending out an email this evening with some information about the sessions tomorrow. Cool. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sonia.
Thank you, Danny. And look, I kept it to time.
Love it.
This discussion could have gone very long.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.